Okay, shall we? So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. Today we'll talk about textual analysis. We'll be first of a few lectures on textual analysis. Today we'll start with qualitative analysis of text. We'll talk about what it is in the second. Shh. Okay, good. So, I have read 430 dissertation abstracts last weekend. That was a lot of fun. And I've discovered that actually quite many of you want to do some sort of textual analysis, which is great. So this will be helpful, although it might feel a little bit dry if you still don't know what your text is. Right? It won't be as practical as the next workshops, which you can sign up for once you know your different techniques. Today and the next workshop will be a little bit about the theory of the method. So what are the different types of analysis you can do? What are the principles? And what is the literature that you can then draw upon when you'll be writing your methodology chapter? So I urge you to ask me questions, but also to keep these slides in mind a few weeks from now or a few months from now when you'll be writing up. Remember, you have to refer to theory of the method as well. In your methodology chapter, you have to write why you did certain choices and how methodological literature informed them. So, today we'll start with the idea of text. What is text? And what are the different ways to approach it academically? Then we'll introduce the qualitative approaches to textual analysis, and then in the next workshop we'll focus on the quantitative approaches to text. I'll provide some examples, but I invite you to think about your examples in your dissertation as we go on. So, brief reminder, there are still places for most of the optional seminars. I think the first R workshop is full, and one or two other workshops are getting full, but there are definitely places in most of them still. So if you are thinking about the method, if you changed your method, if you haven't signed up for the method you're using, please do so now. The links to invites are on Keats. If you cannot find them, drop me an email. They will close a few days before the seminar, so we have an idea about the numbers. So we'll start today with a question of what is a text. We all know what a text is in daily life, but in terms of an academic inquiry, text will be a slightly broader term. There will be many things that we can consider as text apart from just written text. So yes, what we consider text would be the traditional text, such as a book, as an article, but also there will be texts such as interview transcripts, for example, it's a kind of text. An online discussion, or even a tweet. And then we'll talk about how even within those, there are different types of tweets, different types of text. So in a tweet, for example, what do we consider a text? Is this just this? Is this also the number of retweets and likes? Is it the author as well? Right? Are these all features of one text, or can we analyze them separately? These are some of the decisions you will have to make when you're analyzing text. But still, these are examples of written text. And the text that you can analyze is so much more. So yes, there's print text, books, articles, these lecture slides, handwritten letters, texts, tweets, updates, hashtags, and so on. But they could also be images. We treat images as text. So it could be a photograph, a cartoon, a caricature, a painting. These are all items we could do textual analysis on. Symbols, all kinds of symbols, shapes, signs, emojis. And moving images, such as movies, video clips, music videos, GIFs, short videos. This is also a text in analytical terms because it's an item that we can analyze. So we have written text, we have movies, we have images, but also sounds. We can analyze songs. We can analyze different types of sounds, such as noise, right? So unstructured sound. We could have a textual analysis of the noises around us. Data can be a text, even though, well, it's sort of written text, but it's not structured like a traditional text. So tables, code, right? These will all be texts. And finally, spaces could be text as well, right? We could treat this room as a text. A station, a shop, right? These could be all analyzed textually using the same principles as we analyze a text. So the first decision you have to make when you're doing textual analysis is what is the text in your dissertation? What are you treating as text? What will the corpus of text in your work consist of? So treating different types of text as objects for your analysis will lead to very different types of dissertations and very different results. So even if you choose, let's say, online newspaper articles as your text, right? We want to analyze online newspaper coverage of this issue. Still, what precisely are we analyzing? What is our unit of analysis? Would it be just the headline of the articles? Could be. If we say that the headline is the most important part because it draws our attention, readers in 80%, according to some studies, only read headlines and then move on, right? So we could say, actually, in my study, only a headline will be the text. Right? That's a different study that's saying, well, the full article will be the text. I will look at fewer articles, probably, but I will analyze all of it. But do we include comments underneath the article or not? It's another decision. Is it part of the text or not? We could just analyze the comments underneath the articles. So this needs to be clearly defined. What is the unit of text in your analysis? So I gave the example of tweets before, right? So what is the text in your if you're analyzing tweets? Interview transcript, question and responses, these are all text, right? So even if you're not doing textual analysis, you're saying you're doing interviews or you're doing questionnaires, you still will be doing textual analysis on the results you get. You will interview people, they will tell you something, you will write it up, what they told you, and then on this data you will do analysis. You will distribute your survey, you'll get back the results of the survey, you will analyze the results of the survey. And the same with code, with videos, with movies, with episode of scene. We have to decide what it is. If you know you want to look at moving images, you want to analyze transcultural television drama, well, again, will you be analyzing whole episodes? Will you be analyzing certain scenes, certain shots? All these choices become very crucial because they affect the kind of results that you get in the end. These choices get more tricky with online and multimedia because they're so multimodal. So the examples of media like this, right? So multiple types of dimensions of text in here. Right? If we look at music videos or look at animation, how do we analyze this? Do we analyze all of it? Do we analyze just what's on the screen? Do we analyze the melody, the music as well? Do we analyze the rhythm or just the lyrics? Do we analyze the persona of the singer? In this case, a real person. In this person, in that case, a persona, an animated persona, behind which there is a real person. Like, how deep do we go into this analysis? So again, we could decide to do only some of this, right? If you want to look at the trends in music in 2019, you could say, I will just look at the lyrics, because lyrics are important. I will collect X number of music lyrics from this country and look what percentage of them talks about a sad breakup. Okay. But then we're saying we're not looking at melody, right? Maybe the lyrics are sad, but the melody is cheerful, right? This has to do a lot with how people receive music, right? Because people don't just listen to lyrics. When people listen to music, they get the whole package. So how do we then analyze this, right? Again, choices, choices, choices. So online text, especially now, especially increasingly in the digital society, are multimodal. They have more than one mode, not just visual, not just audio, but they have a number of modes. So it becomes the more important how we approach them. So these are just a few kinds of textual analysis, but the ones we will be focusing on this and next workshop. So the first two, especially the first one, will be the subject of our next meeting. And we will then talk about quantitative content analysis. I mentioned it a few times. This will be the type of analysis which is interested in a large sample. We gather a lot of data, a lot of input points, and we look at general trends. We look at certain trends in the frequency of this term. We look at distribution. We conduct some sort of statistical analysis, and we draw statistically relevant conclusions. Well, so with our example, we would gather 200 songs. We will look at the lyrics, and we will have a percentage of how likely is a song in 2019 to be about a sad breakup. And we could compare this, let's say, with 1980, and we say whether this has changed in the span of 20, 30 years. So this type of analysis will allow us to generalize because we will have this huge collection of data, but we cannot go really deep. We can't, because it's just too much data. Because this is a quantitative method, and we cannot be interested in meanings, in feelings, and emotions, and interpretations. It has to be something simpler. So in order to look in depth into the text, we would conduct a qualitative textual analysis, which is the topic of our session today. This is the type of analysis where we would have a smaller sample, not necessarily a random sample like we would have there. It wouldn't be random. It will have a purpose. It will be a purposive sample. But we will look at those texts in detail. We will explore them from a variety of angles, not only textually, but also how it relates to society, how it relates to power, how it relates to discourse. So I'll talk about thematic analysis, discourse analysis, rhetorical analysis, and narrative analysis today. And some I will spend just a bit of time on, some I will spend a bit more time on, but all of them will have references available for you to use later. And all of them you can follow up then with workshops later on. So we'll start with visual analysis, which will be the workshop next week. Visual analysis is an example, just like all the others. It's a type of analysis that could be either quantitative or qualitative, right? It only has to do with the medium, because it's visual. So we're analyzing images or movies, but we can do it, just like here, in the quantitative way or in a qualitative way. So I'm mentioning it because it's often confused. The visual analysis is a qualitative method. It doesn't have to be. It can be quantitative. It just means that we're using the visual medium. to look at, so not written text. So for example, how would it work in practice, right? So we have, let's say, a picture like this, picture from a newspaper that portrays refugees from Middle East and Africa coming in through a shore in Greece in 2015. So if we were to do a visual content analysis, which is a quantitative method, we would gather randomly a large corpus of images like that. We would say, okay, we're interested in all images in all newspapers in the UK that have refugees in them in 2016. We would look at the database, boom, we would end up with 1,000 pictures, maybe too many. We will find a random way to limit the sample. And then we would look for something that can be answered with that method. So what can we actually count without going into the discourse? So we could say, well, we could count, for example, how many women versus how many men are in the pictures. Right. That's relatively easy. We could do that with 200 pictures, right? And then we could say, based on that, well, 80% of refugees portrayed on those pictures are men. Well, doesn't mean that the women are not coming on those boats, but it creates a certain trend that it's mostly young, perhaps dangerous men that are coming here on those boats. So these are the type of things we could do. We could count how many people, for example, we could do individual portraits, how much percentage of all refugee pictures are sort of 1 and 2 people versus group shots. Right? And the research question could be whether the portrayal of refugees in online UK press gives them voice and portrays them as human beings rather than an unidentified mass. So these could be kind of things that we could easily count. Now, if we were to do a qualitative method, we would choose a smaller number of images, and we will look into many other things in this picture, such as the camera angle, for example. Is it looking down? Is it looking up? We would look at the colors. We would look at the vectors in which everybody is looking. We would look at the genre and intertextuality. Right? So we will spend a lot of time semiotically unpacking each picture and relating it to the context. Right? So both studies will answer different questions. In both visual analysis, we could have 2 approaches. So this is something I will cover next week. If you're interested, please sign up to the seminar. Now, talking about qualitative approaches, we'll start with thematic analysis. Thematic analysis is used by students quite often. It is used could be used for any text, really. It's quite often used for interview analysis, for transcripts. But it can be used for any text, visual or written. What thematic analysis does is search for themes, right? Because it's thematic analysis. So this actually image of pattern recognition is quite accurate, right? So we start with different data points, different things. We have a lot of different text. They mention a lot of things, or our interviewees will say a lot of people. And it is us trying to make sense of them, to find some themes, find some patterns. So the process of doing thematic analysis will involve reading the data again, and by doing that, we will slowly start to see some trends. We will try to see some patterns across different interviews or different articles or different images. We will see that some things that we discover in each of those texts are coming up quite often. Well, this would be a theme. There's some literature about how to go about it, and in practical terms, I quite like Brown and Clark, but there are other scholars. Brown and Clark helpfully tell us that there should be roughly 6 phases in how we do a thematic analysis. First, we familiarize ourselves with the data. So that means if you have interviews, we would transcribe them or translate them if necessary. If it's articles, then again, translate, gather them, print them out, put them in a database, and read them again, and just jot down what you think is important, interesting, significant. Right? So this would be familiarizing yourself, generating initial codes. And then the more we read, we would start noticing some emerging themes. We would be collating those small observations into, okay, well, this looks like a theme. This looks like a pattern across the data. Once we've done it, we would review them, right? We would have a collection of themes, and we would say, okay, let's go through the data again and see now systematically whether those themes are really themes, whether they really appear in many of the texts. And then we would name them, right? What is the theme, right? So in our example, the theme would be about something disproportionate between men and women on these pictures. And then we write it up, right? We say what we've done, what are the themes, and what do they mean? What our findings mean? So this would be, in a nutshell, very quickly, thematic analysis. It's a relatively a simple method. It feels like natural, right? Because of course you would read your data first, and of course you would start looking for patterns, right? So it's sort of organizing in an academic way something that many of us do anyway when we are asked to analyze a collection of data. Another method of analyzing text is narrative analysis. Narrative analysis begins with the premise that we all make sense of the world through stories. We understand the world through the stories we tell ourselves about us, about the world, about things that surround us. So when we do narrative analysis of text, we are looking not only for content, but also style, purpose, context, and we look at a chronological account of something. Right? Like it's a story. A story has a beginning, a middle, and the end. Right? So we look for this chronological account. It's often personal, often with an emphasis on voice and style. So for example, it doesn't obviously work for all types of text. An example of a text that this works quite well are life stories. So a special type of interview or a written text in which somebody tells a life story. And the life story has a beginning and the end. It's long, has a narrative. The content is important, but the style is also important. Voice is important. In digital humanities, this could be used and has been used, for example, by people telling their relation with technology since they were born until now. Well, not since they remember, let's say. Right? So very often we would interview somebody, age, let's say 40, 50, 60, 70, and ask them, well, tell us your life. Tell us how you did it. Tell us what did you do. Tell us about yourself. And they would tell a story. It's less structured as a normal interview because we allow them to tell the story. But we shape the interview because we want to find out how technology, digital technology, emergence of platforms, depends what we're interested about, affected their life story. So it could be quite fruitful because, yes, of course we could analyze, we could have a history of technology, who invented what, in what year this platform became popular, and we could also interview people about what they're doing now. But this mixes the two, right? We have an account, very deep account, of how technology is embedded in every life, in daily life of people across decades. So when we have this kind of data, be it a memoir or an interview or a book or a radio show, We could then use narrative analysis rather than thematic analysis, for example, or discourse analysis, to analyze it. Rhetorical analysis would be a slightly different type of analysis. We are interested in rhetorical analysis in how people say certain things, of how certain things are said on top of what is actually being said. So in many cases in rhetorical analysis, the style of speaking or writing would be more important, or at least as important, than what is being said. So we're looking for style. We're looking for emotive language. We're looking for metaphors, for pathos, genre. We're looking at the style of language, either written or spoken. So traditionally, this method has been used in humanities and social sciences to analyze speeches. This is very good for speeches. Speeches are always emotional, well, not always, but speeches tend to be emotional. Speeches tend to have this emotional content, which is sometimes, especially political speeches or social speeches, more important than what is actually being said. But in digital humanities, we can use that, for example, analyzing speeches as well, politicians' speeches, economics speeches, people who are in charge of technology. They very often have very interesting things to say, that when we analyze it using content analysis, actually we find out they didn't say much. But the way they say that not much, that was interesting. Well, we can look at editorials. We can look at, this is a famous edition of Time magazine from 1999, where the editorial was about growing up online. Time magazine was a bit concerned that, well, this is the first generation. Today's kids live in the world of computers and video games. How will it change society? And they were slightly worried. And they were saying, well, these are the opportunities, but also the risks. Right? So the content wasn't that interesting. I mean, there was the sort of standard fears and promises of technology. And Time is a popular magazine, so it wasn't much technological insight. But the ways they framed the argument was interesting. So there we would look at the style. I mentioned it in the previous lecture. I had a student who used rhetorical analysis to look at press releases by Netflix. Right? So Netflix releases press statements. And at the time when the student was researching it, they were moving into producing their own original content rather than relying on licensing other content. So that was it. The content was just it. We are moving towards producing our own content rather than buying other content. So the content was really short, insignificant, not worthy of analysis. But the ways they structured the language, the style of those press releases, that they were trying to reach stakeholders, audiences, the owners, different types of audiences, the style was really interesting and told us a lot about what's going on at Netflix, what is their strategy, about their branding, about the sort of discourse that's going on inside the company, and the link to the outside. So rhetorical analysis, once again, style of speaking or writing. Now I'll spend a little bit more time on discourse and discourse analysis, because this is, again, something that requires a bit more unpacking and is sometimes used by students in textual analysis. So discourse analysis starts with the premise that all language is metaphorical. Right? Language, as you might have heard this idea already, is not something objective. It's not something neutral. Right? Right, so a person saying dog, if I say dog, right, I'm thinking not of a specific dog, I'm thinking about the category of dogs. Right, if I say dog. If I say dog, you know what I mean. But you're probably thinking about a different dog than I'm thinking, right? Your image of what dog is slightly different probably than what I think a dog is. Even though if a dog walked in here, we would all recognize it as a dog, right? But why do we call dog dog? There's no dogginess in the word dog. It doesn't make sense. We could call it cat. We could call it banana, right? It's just a word, right? So language, in a way, is metaphorical. It's always a bit of illusion. It's always a little bit of fiction. So this links to, again, very quickly because I went through this last time, but it links very closely to this debate between positivism and constructivism. Right? If you remember, I talked about how knowledge is created. So this applies to language as well. The positivist account of language will say language is just transmission. It's me saying something and it either reaches you or not. Finish. There is a reality out there that researchers will observe and describe. Right? So there's a text, and it has certain features built into this text. It has only one meaning, and we can either understand the text or not. There's sort of no way in between. If we are very skilled in analysis, we could understand the text better. If we're not very skilled, we miss some of the nuances. Right? So that's the positivist view. The constructivist view is that language is much more than transmission. It's a ritual that we take part of. We co-construct the meanings by interacting. So reality, text, the meaning is not out there. The text doesn't have a meaning just by itself. It acquires a meaning by being published or spoken or streamed in a certain context. So reality in the sense of textual analysis is produced by the act of communicating. Reality depends on text, but also context. So this constructivist side is the side we will be sticking with when we talk about discourse analysis, right? Discourse, according to Stuart Hall, is a social practice. Right? It's not just something out there. It's a social practice which operates through symbols as to produce subjectivities, as to produce something new. Discourse is a group of statements which give us a way of talking about a particular topic. So discourse gives power and meaning through words. Because we have a certain discourse of talking about this topic, this makes us think, this makes us interpret this phenomenon in a certain way. So for example, we need an example, I think. In this way, language has the power to change reality by making certain representations of the world more legitimate, more visible, more powerful than others. So if we look at tabloid first pages, for example, we're sticking with the topic of migrants and refugees. Right? There is a lot going on here in terms of discourse. Right? It starts with words. Right? The migrants on the streets are called swarm. Right? What does it mean to be a swarm? That means not human. Right? A swarm is a group of insects or animals, right? Rather than humans. The swarm is on our streets. Not our, so not there. Right? So there's a lot of meanings embedded in those headlines. Right? What this does is creates a discourse that the migrants, first of all, there are unidentified mass. There's a swarm, they're a swarm, rather than a collection of humans, the discourse of treating them unlike humans, the discourse of linking them to terrorism, even though no such links are being empirically visible. Right? This is all done by discourse. Discourse makes links between identities, emotions, and meanings, and connects them to actions, right? Because what is the next step here? Well, the swarm is on our street, but we need to take care of it. We need to make sure that the swarm is not on our street, because it's our street and not the swarm's street. So this is the symbolic power of language behind discourse analysis, and this is what we would be analyzing using this methodology. Descriptive discourse analysis would sort of stop here, right? We would seek to explain what the language is doing in this context, and in order to better understand both the context and the language. We would say, okay, so this is the language being used for this reason in this context. Critical discourse analysis would go a step further, and we'll say, okay, after having done this, how does this relate to politics? How does this relate to power? How does this relate to socio-economic situation of a given society? So it would have another dimension, a sort of societal dimension. We would go here and we would say, okay, well, what is this tabloid? Who owns it? What kind of views it represent? Who publishes it? When? How does it link with the political situation of this country? What's at stake here? Right? What is the political stake in having these kinds of headings published at this given time? Right? So we'll talk about this power in this way. So how to do it in practical terms? So the main book, the sort of the main expert, Norman Fairclough, tells us about three categories, three dimensions of critical discourse analysis. Right? So generally, we look at how texts come out of and are ideologically shaped by relations of power, the struggles of power. We look at power. Right? Text connects to power. Text connects to ideology. And we do it starting from the first dimension, which is text. So we've done it already, right? Why are certain words and sentences used in the text, right? Why is the word swarm being used, right? Why is our street, right? Why do we call bombers, right? Why does it sponging, right? These are all not neutral words. They were chosen for a purpose, right? How does it work in a whole sentence? We could look at the whole first page, like about the design, how the pictures work with the headline. Right? How this is this picture having a circle around this person, immediately showing, well, this is the bad guy, this is the person of interest, this is the bomber. So textual would be first. Then secondly, we would look at the discursive dimension. And we would look at things such as intertextuality, genre, assumption. So intertextuality, how does it link to other text that we know? How does it link to other popular culture works? How does it link to different types of text? So for example, the swarm on our streets, right? Calling minority swarms, that brings up connotation of different periods of the time where minorities were called inhumane words such as vermin, lice, right? We could talk about sort of World War II propaganda in various parts of the world, right? So we could link it to such other texts. We could talk about genre. What is the genre of this? Right? Yes, we analyze the words, we analyze the sentences, but this is a specific kind of text, right? It's a headline in a tabloid newspaper. So this is a different genre of text than academic essay, It's a different genre than a tweet, right? They're all different. The format is different, right? So that's also something we need to consider. We wouldn't expect this to be an academic essay, right? This is a tabloid headline. What we need to analyze the genre as well. And then finally, says Fairclough, we would reach the societal dimension. So we would say, okay, we have the text, we have the genre, we have the intertextuality. Now, how does this link to knowledge, power, ideology, to public? So this is the interesting part, when we will presumably reach some conclusions, and we will say, what is the role of such publications in online newspapers in 2015? How does this relate to the owners? How does it relate to politics? How does this relate to the state of journalism? Right? So depending what we're interested in, there might be different dimensions of this power. But this is something where we go beyond the text and link it to the world we live in. So this is something quantitative textual analysis cannot really do. I mean, we can write some things about it. There's this trend, and we think it links in a certain way. But actually, only discourse analysis, by going deep enough, can make substantial insight in terms of the links to power and society. Important thing to remember is that when we make those links, it's not just our personal interpretation. It's not just us looking at a picture or a tweet or an article and saying, oh, well, I think that means that. Right? Of course, in many cases, it might start like it. We start with a gut feeling. We read an article and we see, okay, well, that's interesting. But it's important to stay systematic, right? To check those assumptions across the whole corpus of texts. Look for alternative explanations. Well, what if we take a different angle? Right. Lastly, I would like to talk about two things that are shared across all those techniques, which is sampling and reflexivity. So sampling will look a bit different for qualitative techniques and quantitative techniques. In all approaches, as you know, you need to link your method to your research question, right? It's always the research question first, and then the method. Within those methods, sampling will be one of those questions which you have to link to research question as well. Right? Why did you choose these texts to analyze? Why not different texts? Why did you choose this technique of analysis rather than a different one? So the difference between qualitative and quantitative would be that in the quantitative approach, the one where we gather a large sample, we would have a statistical, usually random system of choosing the text, right? So it's again, we would choose a time frame. We say from this month to this month, we look at online database of online articles or tweets with the word refugee. Boom, we have 10,000 tweets. That's too many. So what do? We either narrow down the time frame, or we say we will choose every 100th tweet randomly, right? Or we'll narrow it down maybe based on other factors. Right? But it won't be our decision in a way that there will be a system behind it. Why? Because we're looking for generalization. We're looking for a statistically representative sample. In discourse analysis or thematic analysis, we're not concerned about statistically representative sample because we have a small corpus anyway. It will not be statistically relevant anyway. What we look for is not generalization. So in a way, our sampling will serve a certain purpose. It will be purposive. It doesn't mean that we can just choose any text we want. It means that our sampling will still have to be careful and justified. So it will still be systematic. We still look for certain materials that will serve us best to answer a question. Materials that have conceptual meaning, that have significance to the research, inquiry. But that's about what we can say, because more details will depend on what your research question is. If we're looking for a certain thing, certain idea, if we're looking, for example, we're looking at representations of gender in refugee images, right, to stick with this example. Then in the discourse analysis, we would look for, let's say, 20, 30 pictures that are the most representative of this trend, that give a wide range of gender representations in these images. Okay? So it's a little bit more tricky. You have to be a little bit careful for it not to turn out to be a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, that you know already what you're looking for and you will choose the materials to answer your question as you already know what the answer is in your head. Right? So you have to be checking yourself, right? Do I have any assumptions about this? Am I reflexive enough to consider alternative explanations? So lastly, reflexivity is the key there. So the goal here is to be aware and reflexive rather than unbiased, because I would say there is no such thing as an unbiased research anyway, regardless of the method. Right? So whether it's qualitative or quantitative, every method has bias. No method is objective. Even if you choose your materials completely randomly, well, you still set the parameters in a way. Right? You still asked certain questions to your survey respondents. You still put certain things in the search terms in the database. Right? You still have certain assumptions driving your research question. So it's never unbiased. Rather, it's worth considering a different goal, being reflexive, the research being valid and justified. So what we mean by that is staying specific and staying explicit what we're doing and why, describing the method carefully and describing not only what is being done but why it's being done, being honest about what might have affected the process, considering paths not taken. So you've done this research in a certain way, but if you would do it a different way, would you get different results? If you made this small change in sampling, do you think the results would be completely different? If you asked the different questions to your respondents, do you think your overall results about this group of people would be different? So it's worth considering that to stay on top of your reflexivity. And of course, needless to say, whenever you'll be reporting your findings, you will be also reporting the limitations of those findings. So yes, I found those things, but they are limited to this group. They are limited to the questions I asked. And somebody else might take a different approach and find something else. Okay, I think that's what I wanted to say about qualitative textual analysis. Any questions at all? Yes. Yes, you can combine any methods, yes. Because those methods answer different questions, it's very often used to analyze the same text using different methods. Right? In visual analysis, for example, combination of content analysis and semiotic analysis is very often done. In texts, you could do thematic analysis to have an idea about the themes first, and then you identify, okay, there seem to be three main themes in those texts or images. But now, having understood that there are three themes, I would like to go deeper. So you do discourse analysis with your initial insight. You know those themes already, so your discourse analysis will be even more deeper, right? Because you know the categories that you will analyze. So you can use any of those methods together. But of course, you need to answer your research question, right? So your research question will then cover both of those methods. You can use qual and quant as well, right? You can use a big sample to have a general view, and then say, okay, out of this big sample, we identify frequencies and terms. Now we'll look at smaller sample and look at more interesting questions that will be driven by the answers we already got from quant research. Great question. Any more? Yes.
So if, say, I would like to combine different methods, in the methodology section, I have to explain why I do this.
Yes.
Like, I have to explain what I expect from different methodologies.
Yes. That's right. Yeah. So, because presumably you would know that those, before you do them, that you will do both of them, right? So you would start and say, well, this is my question. This question I cannot really answer with just one method. So I will use them together, or one will inform the other, right? So your methodology section, then have to describe two methods, so it'll be more it will be shorter. Each of the methods could be a bit shorter. You have to take account of this, but it will be exactly as you said, right? Your research question. This is where sub-research questions are being helpful, right? So you have the big research questions that you will answer at the end, but you might also have, let's say, 2 or 3 sub-questions that will pertain to each of the methods. And you say, my research question 1A will be answered by content analysis, 1B will be answered by discourse analysis, my overall research question will be answered by the combination of the results. Okay. I'll let you go. I'll be here if you have more questions. These are the next workshops. And I'll see you either next week or 2 weeks from now. Look at it.